All right. Well, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about certifications and specifically some of the myths that people believe about certifications. And the reason why I'm doing this, every so often people reach out to me, and I've had several conversations with people about certifications, both online and, on social media, but also actually some phone calls that I've had with people about certifications. So, want to get started and talk about that. Now, um, you know, as an example, I was on LinkedIn the last few days, and somebody posted. It was a good post. I had to agree to disagree with some of the things, and I'll explain that as some of the basis for why I'm talking about this today. So, this person posted on social media and said, "Hey, you need to be certified," and I agree with that. Right? That for a lot of people, there's good reasons why you need to have certifications in your career in internal audit. But then they went on to say, and here's the ones you need to have, which that's one of the myths that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. But it was interesting, I started commenting and seeing the questions that people had about some of these different certifications and thought, okay, well, it's time for me to talk about this again. I've also had many discussions with people recently, and I'll share some of those discussions as we go through and talk about some of these myths uh, around certifications. Now, why are we talking about this? Why do we care? Well, again, you can choose to believe me, not believe me. It doesn't matter, right? People have their opinions about this. And the reality is, a lot of organizations have spent years and they have spent millions of dollars in marketing to convince people that you need to have their certifications, right? And so I understand why people believe this, why people are confused. Like I said, from a lot of the questions that I get from people, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, I can understand why people are confused. So that's, again, why I'm doing this video. So the first myth is that you need to have certifications. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that you don't need to have certifications, but you need to decide what's relevant for you. Okay. There's no checklist like, hey, I want to have a career in internal audit. So I need to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different certifications. And if I do that, then I can get a job in internal audit. I'll get hired. I'll be successful. Well, that's a myth. Okay. Now, it does improve your possibilities. It does improve the potential for you to get interviewed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the job. Okay. Because over time, I've hired and fired lots of people. I was head of internal audit. I've been in audit for over 30 years now. And I've also helped thousands of people get certified. So I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, but again, this is just my opinion. And so I want you to, have an open mind as we're talking about this and decide for yourself. Okay. And let me give you an example. Certifications have changed significantly. So a lot of the ones, in this social media post, for example, they said you need to have CIA, CISA, CRMA, CFE, right? Those are the ones you need to have if you're in internal audit. And it depends, right? So I think it's a myth to believe that you have to have certain certifications in order to be successful in internal audit. Because the reality is, internal audit is multidisciplinary, which means, not all auditors do the same thing. And because of that, for different people's careers, certain certifications are going to be more relevant for their career. Okay, just going out and getting a whole bunch of certifications and putting them on your resume does not necessarily help you in your career. The more certifications you have doesn't mean you're going to be hired. The reality is they need to be ones that are relevant for your career. Now, a lot of the traditional certifications that are out there, and again, I'll refer to like CIA, CISA as examples because those are ones that a lot of people feel like you have to have. They were created a long time ago, and they have a lot of requirements that you have to complete. There's certain education you have to have. You have to go through and take multiple tests. The tests are very academic, and it usually takes people years in order to get these certifications. And they were intended to actually limit the number of people who can get them, which is interesting, and I'll probably talk about that here in a little bit. Now, if we take an analogy in the IT area, we can see how certifications are changing, and this also applies to internal audit. Okay, but so if you think about people who are in IT, many of them do not even have a college degree. So why in internal audit do we continue to believe and require, like CISA and CIA, require people to have a degree before you can get certified? In IT, that's not the case. In fact, a lot of people in IT don't have a college degree. You don't have to have a college degree to be an internal auditor. Okay. So, what does IT do? Well, over time, they have developed more technical, more topical related certifications. And so you can look at a lot of the organizations like Google and SAP and some of the different tech platforms, and they create, specific certificates and certifications for people who do work in those areas. And so what the IT people do is some have a degree, some don't, but they end up getting a lot of these technical, practical types of certifications in order to help them do their job. And that's the same trend that we're seeing in internal audit now as well. Okay. Now, another myth is, well, if I have certifications, then I'm going to get a job. Again, that is a myth. That is not the reality. Okay. And having certain certifications does not necessarily mean that you will be more successful at getting the job either. Okay. And so let me explain to you, the hiring process, because I've been a hiring manager many times, and help you understand a little bit more about what the hiring manager is looking at or somebody in HR is looking at. And so a lot of people think, well, hey, I needed to have the CIA. If I have the CIA, then that's going to, help me get a job. Well, from a hiring manager perspective, here's what happens. I post a job. I get hundreds of people who are interested in it. Now I have a stack of hundreds of resumes, and I have to decide who I want to interview. And so I start looking at the resumes. And let's say I'm hiring for an internal audit manager, right? Typically somebody who's 5 to 10 years into their career. And so I'm looking at people, right? And so I start looking at these resumes, and I see maybe some seniors who are ready to be promoted or trying to get into a manager role by taking my position, or people who've been managers other places, right? It could be both. And I start looking at it, and most of the people have similar experience. They have about the same years of experience. Some may have industry experience, some may not. But I have to start looking at these, and I have to start separating into these just go in the junk pile. These are the people we think we want to interview. And so I'm looking for things that make people different. And so if, I get 100 resumes and 100 people have CIA on it, then guess what? That doesn't distinguish them from other job applicants. Okay. Now, if I'm hiring for an internal audit manager and I look and everybody has a CIA, but a few people have things like certified risk-based internal auditor, certificate in internal audit management. Now, all of a sudden I go, hold it. These people are a little bit different than everybody else. So I'm going to move them to the stack of, hey, I think I might want to interview them. Okay. And so that's the reality, right? Is a lot of times, people think, oh, well, the most people have this certification, so that must be the one that I need to do because everybody else is doing it. Well, but that may not be relevant for your particular career, right? And it will not necessarily help you stand out when you're getting hired. And so again, it's an example when I was, on social media and seeing some of the comments, a lot of people jumped in and said, "Oh, CIA is worthless, but you need CISA." Or other people would say, "Oh, you have to have CISA, but CISA isn't good. You have to have CIA to be a real internal auditor." And again, I have to agree to disagree, right? Those are two different certifications that are for different reasons. If you're an IT auditor, CISA is probably a better option for you than CIA. If you're a general internal auditor, CIA is probably better than CISA. In fact, if you don't audit IT, I don't know why you would want to spend the time getting your CISA. Okay. Now, the reality is with both of those, and the other one that was talked about in there specifically was CRMA and CFE. And so a lot of people were thinking, oh, you need to have all four of them. But all four of them don't make sense unless a very particular thing happens, right? If you're an internal audit, you audit IT, and you're looking for fraud around the risk management process, then okay, maybe all four of those are relevant for you. But that's not the reality for most people, okay? So what's more important, what the reality is for you to find certifications that are actually relevant for your career, right? So let's say you work in banking and you're responsible for anti-money laundering. Well, neither the CIA nor the CISA would be that relevant for you, but maybe something around anti-money laundering would be like CAMS, right? That may be more relevant for your career. And so even though everybody else is saying, oh, you got to have these, you got to have these, you got to have these, this other option is probably better for you, right? And so the reality is finding things that work best for your career. Now, CIA and CISA are very academic, okay? They're intended for people who are right out of college with no practical experience. And so typically people who actually are just right out of college and don't have any experience have an easier time passing those exams than people who have years of experience, which you wouldn't think would be the case, but that's what's true. And so again, for me, that kind of questions the value of those certifications if they don't actually help people practically do their job better. Okay. And I'll give you a real life example. This is one of the calls that I had with somebody this week. This person is a number two. So they report to the chief audit executive in their organization. They have a background in engineering and IT, but have spent the last 10 or 15 years in internal audit. And so this person was looking at it and saying, okay, well, I think I want to become a head of audit or get something that is relevant for me as a leader. And so they were looking at the CIA. So they went out, they took part one and they failed. So they said, okay, well, I'll take part two. They took part two and they failed. Right. And that's when they reached out to me and said, now just a minute, right? I've got all this experience, but I failed the exams. What should I do? And as we talked about it, right? And again, this is another myth that people think, well, you have to have CIA in order to be a good auditor. You have to have CIA in order to lead an internal audit function. Actually, no, you don't. The reality is, no, you don't. And in fact, a certification like Certified Chief Audit Executive is much more relevant for people who are already audit leaders because it actually teaches them how to do the job of leading an internal audit function. The CIA has nothing to do with being an audit leader, okay? Believe me, don't believe me, you go look at the syllabus and you'll be able to see that it has nothing to do with being an internal audit leader. Okay. And so, again, as we talked about it, for this person in their career, there's no reason for them to spend 2 to 5 years getting something that will not provide them with any more information on how to do their job. And in fact, it won't help them in doing the job that they currently have. Okay. Another myth is that organizations require it. And so I have to do it. Well, some organizations require it, certifications, but many more organizations are not requiring it. Okay. And so, again, it depends on the organization you're looking at. Some still believe that you need to have certifications, others don't care. And in fact, I was talking to somebody who has been in audit for over 20 years, has done different internal audit roles, first and second line roles over their career. And they were a CIA and a CISA, and they chose to let both of those lapse. They did not renew those certifications. And so I was asking them, well, why did you do that? They said, well, the new job that I just got as an internal manager at a very large company, they don't care about certifications. And so I decided to stop paying for these certifications that I no longer need in my career. Okay. Now, for myself, I was a CIA, I had a CRMA, I was a CGAP, right? These are all ones that the internal audit or IIA put out. And several years ago, I decided, you know what? I'm tired of spending money every year to pay to renew my certifications. And so I stopped paying. And then the IIA decided that they were going to take those certifications away from me because I no longer continued to pay them each year. And that leads us into another one of the myths about certifications. There are a lot of new certifications for internal auditors, but when they look at the price tag, they think, oh my gosh, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500, that's expensive. That's a myth, okay? Because the reality is, for a lot of these traditional certifications, they cost you way more than that. And again, you don't believe me if you don't want to, but what happens is you pay over time, and you don't actually realize how much money and how much time and how much energy you are investing in some of these things. So again, go back to that person that I told you about who tried to take the CIA exam. They're in their midlife and they're like, look, I don't have time to sit here and study, for hundreds of hours to try to pass these exams. I understand. I agree. A lot of the modern certifications don't require that level of study in order to pass lots of tests, right? So for a lot of people, it's not the best for them. Okay. And so, again, it's like, we'll take CIA because, again, that's one most people are familiar with. And a lot of people may say, well, CIA is a lot less money. Look, I only have to pay $250. Yeah. $250 over and over and over and over again, right? I was a CIA for many years. I probably spent $6,000 or $7,000, and I passed the exam the first time, right? But between all of the annual renewal fees and everything else that I had to pay over time, it cost me a lot more than $1,500 or $2,000. In fact, for most people, you have to take the exams multiple times. The average for passing the CIA exam is 2 to 3 times for part 1, 1 to 2 times for part 2, and 4 to 5 times for part 3. That means each time you have to retake the test, you're paying another $250 or $300 for every test. That means most people spend $2,000 to $2,500 just on testing fees. That's before you calculate your time. That's before you calculate training materials or anything else. And so the myth is, right, look at the total cost of ownership as opposed to just looking at nickel and dime kinds of things, right? And especially the way that organizations get you is when you have to renew every single year. So you're continuing to have to pay $200, $300, $400 a year in order to keep your certifications. Now, what are some of the other myths, right, that people believe? I already talked a little bit about, certain ones that are best for your career or ones that people think you have to have, right? And that's not necessarily true, right? Again, what you need to do is step back and realize, what are the things that are best for my career? And for each person, that's going to be different, right? If you're right out of college and you're trying to get a job, there's lots of certifications that you can get, right? And in the description here, I've given some other examples of certifications that are actually more relevant, more practical, have a lot lower time and money investment overall for you to be able to get. Because the reality is, for most people, having certifications on your resume are important, right? Because a lot of people will look at that and think, oh, Jason has these certifications. He must, know somewhat of what he's talking about, right? But again, just having the certification doesn't prove that you actually know how to do the job, right? In fact, some of the best people that I hired over the years were not certified when I hired them. And they were some of the best auditors that worked for me. Other people who had 3, 4, 5 certifications, I would hire and I would have to fire them because they understood academically, they were a good test taker, but they didn't know how to do the job. They couldn't do the job. And so I ended up having to fire them, right? And so, again, some things for you to stop and think about in that, what is it that's going to be most relevant for your career, right? If you're interested in fraud, if you want to work as a fraud examiner, then by all means, go get the CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner, right? If you're in IT, audit, and that's the area that you want to be in, then maybe CISA is the best option for you. I don't know, right? You have to look at it. But the reality is a lot of the traditional certifications require years of experience, years of test taking. And what it means is a lot of people end up putting their career on hold for a while. And I don't like seeing that, right? There are lots of other certifications that are out there. The ones that I refer to in the description here through C-Risk Academy, some people may look at that and think, well, I've never heard of this, so it doesn't have any value. Well, over 20,000 people have been certified that way. So if 20,000 people have chosen to do it, maybe there is value there, right? And they're more topical. Again, things like risk-based internal auditing, agile auditing, more specifics around risk-based internal auditing, about being a chief audit executive and an audit leader, right? There's lots of other things, even certificate programs like around internal audit report writing, around supervision, around internal audit management, around data analytics, some of these other things that are much more topically relevant, and they're ways to help you stand out from the competition. Because again, remember, as I told you, right, if you're trying to get a new job, if you're using certifications as a way to get a new job, you need to do something that makes you different from everyone else. And if you look just like everybody else because you have the same certifications everybody else does, you have the same years of experience everyone else does, you're not going to stand out. And so when an employer receives your resume, yours is probably going to go in the junk pile, right? But if you've done some things that are more relevant to the industry, if you've done some things that are more topically based, right? If I work a lot with chief audit executives, and one of the biggest skills that they can't find in people relates to risk-based internal audit. And again, CIA will not teach you risk-based internal audit. It just doesn't. Again, I know the information, and what's in there doesn't actually help anybody do risk-based internal auditing. And so they're looking for people with those skills, right? So, well, what if you had something like certified risk-based internal auditor on your resume, and your resume shows up for somebody who's looking for people with risk-based internal audit skills? You're going to go in the interview pile, right? But everybody else who just has CIA, yeah, who knows, right? And so, again, a lot of these different topical areas, and really for you to kind of stop and think about, where do you want to go in your career? Like I said, if you want to be a fraud examiner, go get the CFE, right? If you want to be an IT auditor, look at CISA, but maybe look at some other specific things that may help you more, right? If you're going more into data analytics, then find some things that relate to data analytics, right? Other things like CIA are just too general. They're too general, they're too watered down, they're too academic to actually help people in their career. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up. Those are some of the myths and things, that have kind of come through recently in talking with people. And so again, hopefully this is helpful, because, like I said, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and every time, I I get questions for people, because I hear this all the time. People that have failed exams over and over again, and a lot of them are. I even saw one this morning where somebody had failed the exams over and over again and was trying to be positive about it, and everybody's encouraging them, and I encourage them, right? If that's what you want to do, and you want to keep taking tests for years, and you want to keep spending money because that's what's important to you, then go for it, do it, right? But if you're instead looking for something that's more practical, something that takes a lot less time, energy, and money investment, then consider some of the other options like C-Risk Academy. And again, I'm not saying those are the only options, but there may be one there that's right for you. Depending on, again, what you're doing, and where your career is going, there may be other things even outside of the ones I'm sharing that are important for you. The important thing is that you're actually thinking about it proactively. You're looking at it and finding those things that are actually relevant for your career. Sometimes they're industry related, right? If you're in banking, going to banking school is probably more important than getting the CIA, right? Because now you have a deeper industry knowledge, right? And so as you're thinking about it, think about things both maybe from a topical perspective, that are important, like audit report writing, supervision, data analytics, fraud, some of those kinds of things, agile, risk-based auditing. Some of those topical areas may be things that are important for you. There may be industry specific things that are important for you depending on the industry that you're in, right? And I gave you an example of from a banking perspective. But as an example, one of my companies where I was head of audit, we sent all of our auditors to Potato University. Did you know there was a thing called Potato University? Now, why did we do that? Because we were one of the largest producers of potato food products in North America. So it was important for our auditors to actually understand a lot of those processes. So again, hopefully this is helpful. If you have, questions about it, reach out, and I'll do my best to kind of explain or shed some light on maybe what may be most relevant for you. Just like I did with that person who was going after CIA. And I'm like, look, you're already an audit leader. That's not going to help you. Certified chief audit executive is probably going to help you much more. So with that, I'm going to wrap up for today, and we'll see you in the next video.